Imagine holding the key to unlocking the deepest mysteries of the Bible, one that not only opens the door to understanding, but also transforms the way you encounter Scripture. In today's video, Bishop Barron discloses the early church father who did exactly that for him. Who was this father? Stick around to find out. Afterwards, I will explain precisely what this father believed about the Bible and why I believe Bishop Barron believes he is so important. Keep in mind the question arises from another question about how Bishop Barron not only reads the Bible, but how he preaches from the Bible. All right, let's go.
Well, continuing with the liturgy, but shifting to a more personal gear, how do you prepare for a normal Sunday homily? Do you have any particular commentaries or books that you use for preparation?
For the books, it's the fathers, especially Origen. Origen's my man when it comes to the Bible. People say to me all the time, "Hey, Bishop, boy, that homily, what an interesting idea. Boy, that's so novel, and that's such a fresh perspective." And I say, it's from the 3rd century. But it's true. I'm just, because look at even the great Augustine largely cribs from Origen. Augustine's marvelous biblical commentaries, he got it from Origen. Origen's the master, I think. He's the master of biblical reading. And a lot of my stuff I've done like formal biblical commentaries and then preaching, a lot of it is Origen. It's the fathers. That's where I learned how to preach. When I was going through school, it was a different world, and we were not taught to preach that way. We were taught to begin with a joke or a story, relate it to people's experience all the way. And you know what the turning point was for me? This is true. I'm a teacher at Mundelein, and I offered a course called The Christology of the Poets and Preachers. And my purpose there was not to do formal high academic Christology. It was to do Christology as revealed in these more lyrical figures, right? So I had the students read, so I of course had to read it first, the great sermons from Origen through Augustine up to Bernard, into the modern period. We read Newman, we read Chesterton, went up to Paul Tillich, we went the whole range of the tradition. You know what struck me? None of them preached in the way I was taught to preach. Not one. Not from the ancient world through the medieval world to the modern world. The sermons that the tradition preserved were not in the manner that I was taught. That was a real eye-opener, because what I saw was, read Newman's sermons, begin with a joke and relate to people's experience. I mean, Newman is like massively biblical, massively biblical. So is Origen, so is Bernard, so is Aquinas, I'm with Karl Barth. The idea is not correlation, that's Paul Tillich. Barth says it's to draw people into the marvelous jungle of the Bible. The Bible is this rich thicket of personalities and narratives and symbols, and it's a weird country. It's like moving into Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. You need to be introduced to this wild new world. That's preaching. And now draw your world into the biblical world, not vice versa. Don't reduce the biblical world to your little puny world. My experience, ho-hum. Rather, draw your experience into the Bible. There's an asymmetry between the biblical world and our world. They interact. So the same Barth is the one who famously said, "I preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other." Quite right. But it wasn't using the newspaper to read the Bible. It was the Bible to read the newspaper. And that's a difference. That's a huge difference in the way you approach preaching, I think.
Yeah.
So Bishop Barron revealed that the church father that helps him so much to read the Bible is Origen. I want to provide you the approach that Origen takes to the interpretation of Scripture, and also the aim of how he interprets Scripture. What is his approach to Scripture and his interpretation of Scripture, and what is the ultimate aim of his interpretation and what it reveals about Scripture? So the approach of Origen to Scripture is threefold. He likes to interpret the Scripture literally, morally, and allegorically or spiritually, okay? And Origen is famous for this theory. He is the originator of this theory. So firstly, Origen approached Scripture in a literal way. That means that he approaches Scripture in a straightforward manner. That means that he wants to deal with the historical meaning of the text. The second way that he approaches Scripture is morally. That means he is concerned with the ethical teachings or the moral lessons that can be drawn from a given text within Scripture. And thirdly, and probably most famously concerning Origen, is his allegorical interpretation of Scripture. This means that Origen believes that there is a deeper or a symbolic meaning to Scripture that points to spiritual realities beyond just the words and their historical context. Origen emphasizes this level. It's very, very important to him. He believes that there is a deeper spiritual meaning that can be found, and not only be found, it is the most important thing that can be extracted from Scripture. It is the true essence of Scripture, we could say. And this is precisely why I think that Bishop Barron thinks that Origen has helped him to understand the Bible. But it's not just his approach to Scripture, it's also Origen's aim of Scripture. You see, Origen saw Christ as the key to understanding the Bible. So he had a Christocentric interpretation of Scripture, which is ultimately his aim in Scripture. He believed that all of Scripture, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, ultimately pointed to Christ. And more particularly, that the Old Testament was seen as a foreshadowing or a prefiguration of the coming Christ and his work. This is really important too, because I think it shines a light on how Bishop Barron interprets the Scripture, because he references Karl Barth. And Karl Barth is infamous. He's a Protestant theologian, but he's infamous for his Christocentric interpretation of Scripture. For example, Barth said, Scripture is holy and divine. Its holiness and its divinity, however, are in the first place that of Christ. So Barth was basically trying to show that all of Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, were ultimately fulfilled and pointing to Jesus Christ. All of Scripture should be interpreted in light of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, and that includes the Old Testament Scriptures as well. So this is a very fascinating clip, and I just want to know, do you interpret Scripture in the way that Bishop Barron interprets Scripture? I personally do, and I have found it extremely helpful in my personal life and walk. It makes the Bible come alive. When you finally see that the entire Bible points to Christ, it becomes alive to you, much in the same way that Christ is alive and is risen. He is risen indeed. All right, that's all I have for this video. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.